thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Preface to The Strangeness of Columbine, Uninterpretation by Lear's Shadow. Read by The Voice Before the Void. The cover photograph, minus dot and titles, was made on October 26, 2001, by the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, MODIS, aboard the satellite Terra, at an altitude of 440 miles, 705 kilometers, above the Earth. In the photograph as aligned, west is up. The high-resolution, full-color, uncropped version of this image is at the National Aeronautical and Space Administration website, rotated 90 degrees to the left. The caption reads, quote, "An early season snowfall accents the Rocky Mountains through western and central Colorado," unquote. The image is used within the terms on the NASA website, with acknowledgement that NASA owns it, and credit to Jacques Desclôtres, MODIS Land Rapid Response Team. In the photograph as shown, the superimposed white dot at lower center right indicates the location on this landscape of Columbine High School in Jefferson County, Colorado. Apart from being cropped slightly, rotated 90 degrees, and being fitted with the white dot, the image has not been altered from how NASA presents it. Most of the other images in this book were either author-produced or released into the public domain by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. In a very few cases, I'm claiming a right of fair use in a work of analysis and comment regarding issues that have circulated so widely they are of the class of objects that images of Campbell's soup cans became for Andy Warhol. Quotation of primary sources is done with the deepest respect for the extremity of experience that they describe, or to which they pertain. A puzzler. This is a tighter frame on the cover, about 300 miles, 480 kilometers on the horizontal, and 210 miles, 336 kilometers on the vertical. West is up. The dark curve shows the rise of the Rocky Mountain Front Range west of Denver on October 26, 2001. At lower left, the Arkansas River flows south, then east from its source in the Mosquito Range at lower center. The same area produces source streams for the South Platte River, which descends to the plain via South Park and Rampart Range. The white dot shows the location of Columbine High School just north of the Chatfield Reservoir on the South Platte. The satellite Terra, from which MODIS made this record, lifted into Earth orbit on December 18, 1999, atop an Atlas Centaur 2AS rocket launched by NASA from Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. Atlas rockets and Centaur upper stages are built by Lockheed Martin Space Systems Astronautics Operations, headquartered at 12999 West Deer Canyon Road, Jefferson County, Colorado. In this image, just within the dark curve above and to the left of the white dot. The day the Lockheed Martin Atlas Centaur lifted off with Terra MODIS, the planetary service it left behind displayed, in hundreds of thousands of copies, a black and white surveillance image made at high angle. It showed, on the cover of the December 20th, 1999 edition of Time magazine, the interior of the white dot on the previous April 20th. Preface. Some months after the Columbine High School massacre of April 20th, 1999, the film critic Richard Roeper published a column in the Chicago Sun-Times called, quote, "Columbine Gunshots Are Reverberating Still," unquote. In it, he, as a journalist writing for a major newspaper, described a phenomenon, Quote, with other school shootings in places such as Oregon and Kentucky, there'd be a flurry of public attention for a week or so after the tragic event. But then the community would fade from the media's consciousness. Columbine, though, has been different. Columbine just keeps producing ripple effect stories, some sad, some strange, some controversial, some that just make you shake your head in disbelief. Unquote. Roper then produced his own list of, quote, ripple effect stories, unquote, that were recent or current as of the publication date, November 4th, 1999. In 2011, this column can be read at the website and is recommended. Roper's 15-item list developed out of just a 6.5-month time frame. Even so, it was still dense enough that he added, quote, for some reason, the madness at Columbine has produced an inordinate number of strange repercussions, unquote. The ebook into which you are being invited, more than 12 years after Columbine, isn't limited, in sustained consideration of Columbine's, quote, strangeness, unquote, to the period that produced Roper's list. Nor is it limited only to, quote, ripple effect stories and repercussions, unquote. There are so many threads of, quote, strangeness, unquote, in Columbine, that it's sometimes been difficult to know on which ones to focus. My having chosen as I've done is not to imply that other factors were absent in Columbine. Far from it. But as far as I can tell, the ones considered in this ebook have not been explored at all. Why this has been the case, I can't say definitively. Perhaps it has something to do, though, with widespread unconscious immersion in the presuppositions that go with a humanist and or Judeo-Christian and or technological way of understanding the world. Specifically that distinctiveness of place doesn't matter. The textual route of this inquiry will possibly offend some people, or be assessed as utmost effrontery, that I, as an outsider, not from Jefferson County, or Denver, or Colorado, or even the United States, have dared to comment at all. To this I can only suggest, with respectful allusion to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, that sometimes an outsider does see things that those habituated to their presence may overlook as background, but that to the outsider can seem remarkable. That being said, the perspective developed in this ebook is not that of de Tocqueville. What follows may not be an easy read. The subject matter is not breezy, and would be disrespected by any affectation of a breezy tone. Perhaps I ought also to make clear that, to the best of my admittedly biased awareness, the development of this perspective has not been informed by any mental illness. It's just a different way of noticing, piecing together, thinking, whose implications I can't claim fully to understand myself. I'm not a journalist and did not work from interviews, but rather from texts and images which made for a pattern of inference. You, the reader, are free to disagree with this pattern of inference, or with any part of it. The texts and images from which the inferences are drawn, however, that exist in publicly archived books and records, or in verifiable copies including on the internet, are a different matter. They exist as documentary fact. Much of this ebook consists of presentation and analysis of such material. Perhaps occasionally I'll overreach in interpretation, but I'll dare to say, not always. Because the approach is unusual and unfolds over 21 chapters in 3 parts, it seems fair to provide you, the reader, with a preliminary roadmap. Part 1, called Columbine 1999/2010, is in 8 chapters. Were this a paginated book, it would be about 104 pages long, based on 6x9 single-spaced 12-point format. It begins with an examination of elements of, quote, strangeness, unquote, embedded in Columbine as an event from its opening moment, the fatal shooting of Rachel Scott and serious wounding of Richard Castaldo at 11:19 a.m. Mountain Time on April 20th, 1999, by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. This was Columbine's threshold, whose crossing brooked no return. Its constitutive details deserve examination. A focus on Columbine's first moments is not followed by chronological description of the rest of the massacre in detail. This has been done multiple times elsewhere, including schematically in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office official report of May 15, 2000, available online, in books by Jeff Cass and Dave Cullen, and at a Columbine site as an internet resource run by Sin Shepard. To do it again would be to compete in morbid voyeurism. Columbine's extremity of horror, set in motion in its opening moments, is assumed, as underwriting both the style and tone of the inquiry which follows. Instead of such description, then, and in keeping with the theme of strangeness, there is a jump cut ahead 11 years and 7 months, to mid-November 2010, and an incident near the Cherry Creek Reservoir in Arapahoe County, just east of Columbine High School. It involved 2 twin sisters from Australia who were 29 years old, approximately the age that Rachel Scott, Eric Harris, and Dylan Klebold, as well as 2 other female fatalities of Columbine, Cassie Bernal and Lauren Townsend, would have been, had they survived, and of Richard Castaldo, who did survive. The 2 young women rented pistols and shot themselves at an outdoor practice range called the Family Shooting Center. One twin died, the other lived. A ripple effect story that was more like a there and gone ripple effect tsunami that itself left, quote, an inordinate number, unquote, of strange debris. One of these was the photocopied cover found in the twins' luggage of the May 3rd, 1999 issue of Time magazine that depicted Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold as, quote, the monsters next door, unquote, and asked, quote, what made them do it, unquote. Another was a photograph that suddenly began to appear in articles, described as, quote, supplied, unquote. This particular scenario of, quote, strange repercussions, unquote, 11 years after Columbine, leads in its specificities to a piece of writing by Dylan Klebold. And this, after some analysis, leads to 2 pieces of writing by Eric Harris. All were part of a 946-page document release by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office on July 6, 2006. These legacies of written words suggest levels of complexity in both boys and in their relationship to the event called Columbine that beggar their generic, quote, profiling, unquote, initially by the FBI and most prominently by Dave Cullen in his 2009 book Columbine as, quote, the depressive, unquote, who followed, and, quote, the psychopath, unquote, who led. In particular, there are within these texts distinctive phrasings that haven't previously been isolated out and given the closer look that they, for multiple reasons, invite. In Dillon's text, the phrasing has to do with, quote, place, unquote. And in Eric's with, quote, nature, the mountains, and the lake, unquote. These terms, considered in context, are like hinges that open a door on a second look at what has become, perhaps especially since publication of Cullen's Columbine, the widespread acceptance of a set of assumptions about the event whose name the book takes as its own. These were framed succinctly by Cullen himself in a March 2009 interview with The New Yorker, just before the book's publication. The interviewer, Lila Bjach, asked, quote, "Do you think Columbine could have happened anywhere? Why did it happen where it did?" Unquote. Cullen replied, quote, "It could definitely happen anywhere. I think there's one primary reason it happened here, and his name is Eric Harris. Eric's father was an Air Force officer who moved the family across 5 states in 15 years. If he had settled in any of those other locations, something horrible would have happened there. If Eric had grown to adulthood, it could have been much worse. He was a budding young psychopath who enjoyed inflicting pain." Unquote. The strangeness of Columbine challenges the full range of these assessments, as it challenges also Cullen's having given, in his book, barely 2 sentences to Columbine's threshold moments involving Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo, and his having given no sentences at all to the, quote, there, unquote, of Columbine. This subtext of challenge might not be worth pointing out, but that Cullen's Columbine was both aggressively marketed by its New York publisher as, quote, the definitive account, unquote, and endorsed by Oprah Winfrey as, quote, the first complete account of the Columbine tragedy, unquote. I don't believe it to be, quote, complete, unquote, at all, or even accurate. And conversely, I do believe that there has to at least be available, whether people want to read it or not, an interpretation of Columbine that both respects its complex specificity and admits the existence of the, quote, strange, unquote. Something else that Cullen does not do. Period. As part of this process, and tied to the fact that Columbine's legacy includes texts, the strangeness of Columbine also incorporates reference to works by multiple authors, 3 of them prominently enough to justify a chapter heading, 1 per part, as the table of contents shows. The point of these comparisons is to recognize what appear to be gateways into patterns. Readers of Lear's Shadow between 2000 and 2008 will perhaps remember Calvin and Eric, Dillon and Hobbes. It is not repeated here, either in whole or part. Rather, the document release of July 6, 2006, as well as correspondence with Brooks Brown, as a friend of Dillon, Rachel, and sometimes Eric, as well as the co-author No Easy Answers, The Truth Behind Death at Columbine, 2002, suggested an entirely different route into the relevance of Calvin and Hobbes. So it is with both respect and some awe that I, in Part 1, approach the written and drawn public legacy of Bill Watterson. Part 2, called Sand Creek, 1863 to 1864, consists of 6 chapters and would be about 105 pages in a printed book. It follows the threads of, quote, place, nature, mountains, lake, unquote, in a different way, via patterns of cross-reference that greatly surprised me when I noticed them, but that were so striking I could not ignore them. They involve, on the one hand, certain of Eric Harris's writings, including the texts in Part 1, and on the other, some passages left by the 19th century American author Fitzhugh Ludlow, 1836 to 1870. On June 10, 1863, Ludlow visited the area southwest of Denver that more than a century later would be the site of Columbine High School. He traveled in a horse-drawn, quote, ambulance, unquote, provided by the governor of the Colorado Territory, John Evans, and left a detailed record of the experience. In 2005, I found this in Ludlow's 1870 book, The Heart of the Continent. He is the touchstone author of Part 2, and the pattern of homology with Eric Harris's written record is such as to open a kind of time tunnel, initially via June 10, 1863, into an earlier vortex of Colorado history that culminated most indelibly on November 29, 1864, in the Sand Creek Massacre. Documentation of the lead-up to and aftermath of this massacre, as well as of the massacre itself, suggests a manifold texture of similarity and reversal between it and Columbine, as two events of utmost violence and brutality whose vortices developed over time in the same region, whose culminating horror was peculiarly theatrical, and whose, quote, repercussions, unquote, were profound. The terms of this comparison point to a number of things, among them a working concept toward a better understanding of Columbine's resonance, a previously unexamined set of plausible factors in the lead-up to Sand Creek, a different vocabulary in regard to, quote, place, unquote, and, perhaps, a different level of misapplication of the term, quote, psychopath, unquote, to Eric Harris. Part 3 is called Jefferson County 2001. It consists of 7 chapters, and would be about 116 pages long were this a book. It explores still further the themes of, quote, place, mountains, and nature, unquote, in relation to Columbine, through a photographic record of visits in January 2001 to sites in Jefferson County, Colorado. These are specifically the alleyway behind 6657 West Ottawa Avenue, where Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold worked prior to Columbine, and the area of Dylan Klebold's house in the Deer Creek Mesa development west of Littleton, as reached from the north via Red Rocks Park. Various cues in these photographs evoke not only Fitzhugh Ludlow's additional visit on June 10, 1863, to similar Fountain Formation rocks just to the south, but also multiple dimensions of a novel written more than a century later by the author of, quote, horror fiction, unquote, Stephen King, called The Shining. In this case, the text comes with supplements. The cinematic interpretation given The Shining by Stanley Kubrick in 1980, and a 3-part, 4.5-hour ABC TV miniseries version by King himself in 1997. But the fact is that King developed, prior to Columbine and in the same plain meets mountains zone of central Colorado, a convincing nightmare story around a phenomenon he called, quote, shining, unquote. This conceptual vocabulary was then adapted and added to, with considerable resilience, over 20 years, first by Kubrick, and then again by King, whose miniseries adaptation aired between April 27th and May 1st, 1997. These dates themselves happened to fall between the second and third journal entries of a 15-year-old boy named Dylan Klebold, who was living in a house owned by his parents just 60 miles southeast of Estes Park, as the setting for both the novel and the TV remake of The Shining. In incorporating literary works in these different ways, I drew some inspiration from the style, structure, and content of D.H. Lawrence's 1923 book, Studies in Classic American Literature, especially the chapters on the spirit of place and Fenimore Cooper's White novels. Not everything Lawrence put in these chapters, that he wrote as a visionary critic rather than as a novelist, makes sense to me. But a few things do. As to who I am, the relevant detail would seem to be that for nearly 6 years after Columbine, from May 2000 to early 2006, I maintained and added to a website called Lear's Shadow, most of whose content, initially anyway, pertained to Columbine. I cannot say why I did this website, which did not make money. What I can say is that Columbine shook me deeply, and I tried, out of some earlier experience of Colorado to the east, south, and west, to understand why. The Internet, with its absence of gatekeepers, seemed to provide a platform both for articulating this process and for sharing it with others. For multiple reasons, I stopped adding to Lear's Shadow in 2006 and emptied it of content in 2008. By then, it had registered over 300,000 hits. My own attempt to exit Columbine, however, then received a sequence of surprises. The first of these was the hyped publication of Cullen's Columbine in April 2009, to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the massacre. The book's one-dimensional diagnoses and the boppy avidity which Cullum affirmed then were dismaying. So too were representation of the book as the, quote, definitive account, unquote, its endorsement by Oprah Winfrey as, quote, the first complete account, unquote, and its rapid eclipse of Jeff Cass's more sober, probing, and insightful Columbine, a true crime story, which was published at the same time by a small Denver press, rather than out of New York. Cass's book is chock full of detail about the complex human dynamics that fed toward Columbine, as gathered by an admirably on-the-ground gumshoe journalist. It neither excuses nor indulges authority. And it also references historical context, including 7 paragraphs on Sand Creek, pages 24 to 25, in situating Columbine as an event. But it does not signify, and did not fare well in the intensely marketed glare of Cullen's Columbine, that in January 2011 could still elicit this memorable online review comment from an American woman blogging as Bridget of Arabia. Quote, I really appreciated reading this book and having it all tidied up and cleared away, once and for all. unquote. This is undoubtedly what many Americans fervently hope might be the case about Columbine, that it might, quote, all be tidied up and cleared away once and for all, unquote. Dave Cullen, along with his publisher, recognized the craving and provided the, quote, definitive and authoritative, unquote, Columbine. It did very well, with a Broadway play and a Hollywood movie deal reportedly in the works. Both of which would seem to imply, however, still more Columbine, which is to say, not, quote, cleared away, unquote, at all. Instead, morphed into a smoothly humming engine of potential profit for someone audacious enough to have claimed negotiable, quote, rights, unquote, to it as represented in his book. The mind reels. The second surprise that got my attention was the discovery in August 2009 that someone had retrieved 10 of Lear's Shadow Columbine pages, including visuals, from the Internet Wayback Machine, and made them available as a free mega upload at the Super Columbine Massacre RPG, quote, Thoughts on the Shooting, unquote, forum, under the heading Excellent Columbine Pages. The necessary inference from this development was that if these 10 early pages were again easily available, then it would be irresponsible for me not to supplement them with a perspective informed not only by the passage of time, but by the July 6, 2006 document release, whose significance I was then beginning to grasp. And especially did this seem the case given the relentlessly foreshortening effect on discourse of Columbine, the Devouring Machine. The third surprise was the incident of the Hermelier twins in November 2010 that included the public resurfacing of the May 3, 1999 cover of Time magazine. This was especially jarring in that it happened to have been with a photograph and meticulous description of this cover that the opening Columbine text at Lear's Shadow, from Absolute Other to Eric and Dylan, began its online presence from 2000 to 2008. This description was even supplemented in 2003 with a layer-by-layer visual deconstruction of the cover's images and design. In view of this, I could hardly ignore the fact that, in the record established by the website's counter, hits from Australia, as identified by country suffix between 2000 and 2008, trailed only those from the USA, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and ran into thousands. Perhaps it was coincidence that the Hermelier twins had focused on the same cover. But perhaps not. And either way, I again felt a sense of obligation, at that point, to try to think these phenomena through. This process brought still more surprises. Like Lear's Shadow as a website, the strangeness of Columbine has not been vetted by a book publishing gatekeeper. I hope there aren't, in consequence, too many typos, and that the visuals do not appear as mush. I am also acutely aware that I've left out almost as much as I've included here, and hope that in decisions I've made the optimum choices. But there does come a time when something has to be sent out. This is taking place via ebook, in part because of the direct access portal the medium provides to potential readers, even as, unlike the website, it offers the possibility of modest compensation for 11 years' worth of thought and work. To an extent, I regret that The Strangeness of Columbine is not available in print on paper, so that copies might be purchased or accessed by interested people who don't have an e-reader. In this I sympathize. I don't, at time of writing, have an e-reader myself. But a publisher would take months or even years to bring out a book, assuming I could find one willing to risk it, while an independent print run would cost thousands of dollars and present me with hundreds of objects that I'd need to disperse from a remote location. Nor can I find many positive recommendations for print on demand. These factors aside, though, by far the bloodiest part of the Columbine High School massacre, that I'm not going to consider at length here, took place amid shelves of books. Since then, I've had trouble investing wholeheartedly in doing another print-on-paper book myself. Books that I did with publishers after Columbine, between 1999 and 2003, were already in process as books when Columbine happened, so they got carried through. But Columbine also produced Lear's Shadow. And as these investigations got their start via an electronic medium, it seems apt not only to develop them that way, but to leave behind the authorial persona and name that preceded them. There are clearly some limitations to the ebook format. An index is impossible because there is no pagination, though it seems reasonable to expect that words will prove searchable. Endnotes may be within the realm of the possible, but even if they are, they're beyond my current means. Should circumstances at some point permit, I would like to provide page and phrase-based notes. As matters stand, references that seem necessary are in brackets in the shortest form possible. Those that begin with JC are from the document case files made public by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. What the ebook format does allow is color images, in the likelihood that e-readers will not be bound indefinitely to grayscale graphics. Color would be financially inconceivable in any print-on-paper book I might try to do myself, but was certainly integral to the style of Lear's Shadow. As I'm not sure how these images will show on various e-readers, I'm also making them available by chapter and in clearer resolution at the Lear's Shadow website address. Included there also is a bibliography. Various people have encouraged this enterprise over 11 years. I thank them, and apologize to any whom I may have offended, or whose feelings I may have hurt, through my occasionally profound lack of social skills. As a courtesy, I do not name those I thank. Given the passions that seem to inform the discourses of both Columbine and Sand Creek, there may be readers of this text who, though it was produced out of deepest respect for the memory and pain that came out of these events, are not pleased. And as I do not know what the outcome will be of my producing this ebook, perhaps it's best that no one else be implicated. The Strangeness of Columbine, on interpretation, develops a style of thought that is unusual. Nevertheless, I hope that the interwoven exploration of events in relation to place, texts, images, and history will prove illuminating.